Welcome to Imperial History, the podcast where we explore the epic stories of empires that shaped the world, from their triumphant rises to their dramatic falls. I am your host, Eric Alexander. In our last episode, we witnessed the fall of Perdiccas, the empire's first great regent. His end did not come on the battlefield, but through betrayal. His senior commanders, Antigones, Python, and Seleucus, turned against him, sealing his fate. With Perdiccas gone, the generals convened once more to divide Alexander's vast empire, like vultures feasting on the remains of a dying beast. The result? The infamous partition of Triparadisus. Antipater, the shrewd elder statesman, emerged as regent and the de facto ruler of Europe. Across the Aegean, Antigonus, one of Alexander's most brilliant generals, claimed a large share of Asia. Meanwhile, the conspirators who brought down Perdiccas were handsomely rewarded. Antigones gained southern Persia, Python took Media, and Seleucus secured Babylon. Yet, not everyone was willing to play by these new rules. Enter Eumenes of Cardia, Alexander's secretary and most trusted scribe. To many of the empire's hardened commanders, he was little more than a bureaucrat. But with Perdiccas dead, Eumenes stepped into the spotlight as the last true defender of a unified Macedonian empire under the Argead dynasty. He was not fighting for personal gain. He was fighting for the legitimacy of Alexander's heirs. Or so he wanted others to believe. To the new power structure, Eumenes was nothing less than a traitor. Antipater made his intentions clear. Eumenes had to be destroyed. The task fell to Antigonus, who was handed an army vast enough to crush any resistance. Overnight, Eumenes became an outlaw, a man with no country, no official authority, and enemies on every side. But he was not alone. He still commanded a veteran army, and Eumenes was no ordinary leader. He was cunning enough to outwit even the most seasoned generals. To his soldiers, Eumenes framed his cause not as rebellion, but as loyalty. He declared the so-called New Order a betrayal of Alexander's legacy. The kings. Philip III and Alexander had been seized by traitors, he argued. By fighting under his banner, his men were not rebels. They were the true defenders of the Argead house. Was this propaganda? Of course. But for these battle-hardened soldiers, men who had marched with Alexander to the ends of the earth, it worked. Eumenes did not just preach loyalty, he embodied it. Take his journey to Mount Ida, for example. This was not a random detour, it was a calculated move. Mount Ida housed a royal stable filled with war horses, an invaluable resource for rebuilding his cavalry. Eumenes raided the stable, but here is the fascinating part. Even as an outlaw, he filed a formal account of the raid with the overseers. He kept meticulous records, following official procedure as if he were still serving the Argead kings. When Antipater heard about this, he reportedly laughed, amused by the absurdity of an outlaw playing by the rules. But was it absurd, or was it a stroke of genius? Eumenes was not just taking horses, he was sending a message. To his enemies, his soldiers, and even to history, he was declaring, I am not the traitor here. I am the one upholding the law. The so-called rulers are the true rebels. As Antigonus prepared to march with his overwhelming army, Eumenes readied himself for the fight of his life. He had no illusions about the odds. But Eumenes, ever the strategist, was not just fighting to survive. He was fighting for an idea, a vision of a united Macedonian empire, and he would stop at nothing to defend it. It is 319 B.C., and Eumenes, commanding a cavalry-heavy force prepared to make a stand against an enemy superior in infantry. The battlefield was no accident. He had chosen the flat terrain carefully, knowing it would favor his cavalry. But Eumenes was not only fighting with soldiers and strategy, he was battling politics as well. In Sardis, Cleopatra of Macedon, Alexander the Great's sister and an old friend of Eumenes, resided. She was a powerful symbol of legitimacy in the fractured Macedonian Empire. Eumenes hoped to gain her support, but Cleopatra, ever pragmatic, warned him against it. Supporting him would invite the wrath of Antipater, the regent of Macedonia, and she knew all too well the high cost of backing a losing cause. Reluctantly, Eumenes heeded her advice. He retreated north into Phrygia for the winter, but winter brought no relief. His army began to unravel. 3,500 soldiers defected. To maintain discipline, Eumenes executed the ringleaders of the defection, but pardoned the rank-and-file soldiers. It was harsh, but necessary, a reminder that leadership in such turbulent times was a tightrope walk between fear and loyalty. When spring arrived, so did the resumption of war. Antigonus, one of Alexander's most formidable successors, marched into Cappadocia, forcing Eumenes into battle at Orkynia. Once again, Eumenes sought to leverage favorable terrain for his cavalry. But betrayal struck at the worst moment. A mercenary cavalry unit, bribed by Antigonus, defected mid-battle. Chaos erupted. Lines broke, trust dissolved, and what had begun as a calculated encounter became a disastrous rout. Eumenes lost 8,000 men and was forced to retreat. Yet defeat did not break him. Instead, he acted swiftly, hunting down the leader of the treacherous cavalry and executing him. This act, though symbolic, was critical in restoring trust and morale among his remaining troops. As Eumenes fled north, pursued relentlessly by Antigonus, he made a surprising decision. Returning to the battlefield, not to fight, but to bury the dead, he upheld an ancient tradition of honoring the fallen. Antigonus, in his haste to continue the chase, had neglected this duty. Plutarch notes that this act impressed even Antigonus, who paused in admiration. In a brutal era where survival often outweighed humanity, Eumenes' choice to honor the dead stood out as a rare moment of decency. By winter, Eumenes' position had grown even more precarious. Desertions had reduced his army to a loyal core of just 600 men. Retreating to Nora, a well-supplied and nearly impregnable fortress on the border between Cappadocia and Lycaonia, Eumenes employed guerrilla tactics to fend off Antigonus. Quick strikes and strategic retreats kept the enemy at bay. Antigonus, unwilling to risk the cost of a full siege, turned to negotiation. Eumenes, ever the strategist, demanded hostages as a guarantee of good faith before agreeing to any talks. When Antigonus insisted that Eumenes address him as a superior officer, Eumenes famously replied, "While I am able to wield a sword, I shall think no man greater than myself." That defiant statement encapsulated Eumenes' character. Though not a king or prince, his unwavering belief in his own worth set him apart. Eumenes and Antigonus were no strangers. Before the successor wars, they had been friends. Now, they stood on opposite sides of history. During their negotiations, Eumenes demanded the restoration of his satrapy in Cappadocia and the lifting of his status as an outlaw, reasonable terms for a man who had proven his loyalty and skill. Antigonus promised to send these demands to the regent, Antipater, in Macedonia. But history had other plans. In 319 B.C., Antipater, the regent who held the fragile empire together, died. With his death, the political landscape shifted once again. and the war for Alexander's empire intensified. Antipater's death was like throwing a lit torch into a barrel of oil. His empire, already fragile, shattered completely. In a move that surprised many, Antipater chose Polyperchon, his most senior commander, as his successor. This decision enraged Antipater's son, Cassander, a man consumed by ambition. Antipater reportedly claimed that Cassander, at 36, was too young for the role, a questionable excuse given that Alexander the Great had conquered the known world by the age of 32. Perhaps the real reason lay in Cassander's perceived shortcomings, but Cassander was not a man to accept being sidelined. Unwilling to let his father's decision stand, Cassander sought out Antigonus to propose an alliance. Together, they set out to challenge Polyperchon for control, plunging the empire into civil war. Once again, Alexander's legacy became the battlefield for endless conflict. But what of Eumenes during this upheaval? Polyperchon, desperate for allies, reached out to Eumenes with an extraordinary offer. Not just a pardon, but authority. Authority over every general in the empire. This transformed Eumenes from a fugitive and minor player into a force to be reckoned with. Freed from his confinement at Nora, Eumenes seized the opportunity. He raised an army and began his march south into Cilicia. Meanwhile, Antigonus, now allied with Cassander, had his own battles to fight. In Asia Minor, he confronted Cleitus, the satrap of Lydia, and a staunch Polyperchon ally. Cleitus had assembled a fleet in support of Polyperchon, but Antigonus, ever the strategist, caught him by surprise. At the Battle of Byzantium, Antigonus decisively destroyed Cleitus's forces on both land and sea. Having crushed Cleitus, Antigonus turned his attention eastward. Determined to eliminate this rival, Antigonus marched into Cilicia, intent on putting an end to Eumenes' rebellion once and for all. While Antigonus was clearing the board in Asia Minor, Eumenes was making bold moves of his own. He seized control of Cilicia, Syria, and Phoenicia, forging a crucial alliance with Antigenes, who commanded the Silver Shields, the elite veterans of Alexander's campaigns. These soldiers, unmatched in skill and experience, were the most formidable force of their time. Their allegiance was a prize beyond measure, and now they marched under Eumenes' banner. Eumenes was always one step ahead. Whether it was through spies or sheer intuition, he seemed to know Antigonus's every move. Anticipating what was to come, he abandoned his stronghold in Phoenicia and set out on a bold march through Syria and Mesopotamia. His objective? To rally support from the eastern satrapies, territories far beyond Antigonus's immediate grasp. His first success came in Mesopotamia, where he secured the backing of Amphimachos, the satrap of the region. This alliance was a pivotal win, granting Eumenes safe passage to Babylonian territory. There, he placed his army in winter quarters, a much-needed pause in the hostilities, offering his forces time to recover and strengthen. However, not all satraps welcomed Eumenes. Seleucus, the powerful satrap of Babylonia, and Pithon, the satrap of Media, withheld their support. Yet, Eumenes managed to rally most of the satraps from territories east of the Zagros Mountains, consolidating his position in the region. Meanwhile, Antigonus was on the move. After securing his hold over northern Syria and Cilicia, he advanced into Mesopotamia, determined to close the gap between himself and Eumenes. By the time Antigonus reached Susa, he delegated Seleucus to besiege the city and pressed on in pursuit of his elusive rival. The confrontation was inevitable. The clash came at the River Kopratas, in what is now modern-day Iran. It was here that Eumenes demonstrated the brilliance that made him one of history's most formidable tacticians. Antigonus, caught mid-crossing with his forces exposed, suffered a devastating blow. Eumenes' army struck with precision, killing or capturing 4,000 of Antigonus's men. For Antigonus, it was nothing short of a catastrophe, forcing him to retreat north into Media. While regrouping, Antigonus continued to pose a threat to the upper satrapies, keeping the pressure on Eumenes. At this critical juncture, Eumenes faced a harrowing choice. His instincts urged him to march westward, to sever Antigonus's supply lines and leave him vulnerable. But the coalition Eumenes had painstakingly built now worked against him. The satraps, focused on defending their own territories, refused to support such a bold maneuver. Bound by the fractured priorities of his allies, Eumenes was forced to remain in the east, a strategic misstep, not born of his own failings, but of the fragile nature of his alliance. By late summer of 316 BC, Antigonus was ready to strike once more. He moved south, determined to force Eumenes into a decisive confrontation. The stage was set for the Battle of Paraitakene, a bloody, chaotic clash that ended in frustrating inconclusiveness. Eumenes inflicted heavier casualties on Antigonus's forces, but under the cover of darkness, Antigonus managed to withdraw his army, narrowly avoiding total disaster. The war dragged into the winter of 316 to 315 B.C. with no resolution in sight. Antigonus, ever the cunning strategist, attempted a daring gamble, a grueling march across the desert to catch Eumenes off guard in Persia. But his plan was foiled when local informants spotted his army and alerted Eumenes. Once again, the two rivals prepared for battle, this time at Gabiene. The Battle of Gabiene was a turning point, though not because of Eumenes' battlefield tactics. Ironically, he had the upper hand. Instead, it was betrayal that undid him. During the fighting, Antigonus captured Eumenes' baggage camp, which contained the soldiers' most prized possessions, their loot, families, and hard-won comforts. For the silver shields, Eumenes' elite veterans and the backbone of his army, this loss was devastating. Antigonus exploited the moment brilliantly. He offered the silver shields a cruel bargain, their precious baggage in exchange for their commander. These men, undefeated for decades and famed for their loyalty to Alexander the Great, made a fateful decision. They turned on Eumenes, handing him over to Antigonus to reclaim what they had lost. With Eumenes now a prisoner, Antigonus held all the power. What to do with such a formidable rival? Antigonus reportedly debated sparing him, perhaps out of respect for Eumenes' strategic genius or a desire to preserve his own reputation for clemency. But his council had no such reservations. Eumenes, the man who had defied Antigonus and led armies against him, was sentenced to death. With his execution, the curtain fell on one of the most compelling figures of the successor wars, a reminder that in the violent and treacherous world of Alexander's heirs, even the greatest commanders could be undone by betrayal. While Antigonus pursued Eumenes in the east, Cassander was waging his own campaign against Polyperchon in the west. By 317 BC, Cassander had gained the upper hand. The year before, Polyperchon's fleet had been utterly destroyed, a devastating blow to his ambitions. Cassander seized the opportunity created by the chaos, moving swiftly to secure Athens. With the city firmly under his control, he turned his sights northward. Macedon itself was vulnerable, and Cassander had little trouble forcing Polyperchon out. It was then that Philip III, at the urging of his ambitious wife Eurydice, named Cassander regent. At first glance, this might have seemed like the end of Polyperchon's story, but the man was far from finished. Exiled from Macedon, he fled west to Epirus, where he found an unlikely and powerful ally, Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great. Alongside her were Alexander's widow, Roxana, and their young son, Alexander IV. For those still loyal to the bloodline of the legendary conqueror, this trio represented a glimmer of hope. Olympias understood this, and she was determined not to let Cassander extinguish that hope without a fight. In Epirus, Olympias and Polyperchon forged an alliance with King Aeacides. Together, they prepared for a bold counterattack. Olympias herself led an army into Macedon, while Cassander was occupied in southern Greece, suppressing pockets of resistance. Olympias's forces met those of Philip III, but the battle was over before it truly began. Most of Philip's soldiers refused to fight against the mother of Alexander the Great. The result was a crushing defeat for Philip. He was captured, and Olympias acted decisively. She had him executed. Eurydice, his wife, was forced to take her own life. For Olympias, leaving Philip alive was too great a risk. He could always be used as a pawn by her enemies. With Philip gone, only her grandson, Alexander IV, held a legitimate claim to the Macedonian throne. But Olympias's triumph was short-lived. Cassander, a master of cold, calculated strategy, regrouped and marched north from the Peloponnesus with a vengeance. As his forces advanced, Olympias's support began to falter. Many who had initially rallied to her cause now saw defeat as inevitable. By 316 B.C., Cassander had cornered Olympias. Her capture marked the end of an era. Ruthless to the end, Cassander ordered her execution, silencing one of the last towering figures directly connected to Alexander's legacy. With Olympias gone, Cassander took Roxana and the boy king Alexander IV into custody, effectively ending any immediate threats to his rule. As for Polyperchon, he retreated to the Peloponnesus, clinging to a few fortified strongholds. Though he survived the Second War of the Diadochi, his influence dwindled, and he would play only a minor role in the wars that followed. By the end of the war, the map of Alexander's empire had been redrawn. Antigonus now held sway over Asia Minor and the vast eastern provinces, while Cassander ruled over Macedon and much of Greece. But, as history has shown us time and again, stability is nothing more than a fleeting illusion. With Antigonus towering over his fellow Diadochi in both power and territory, paranoia began to fester among the other successors. Alliances shifted, conspiracies brewed, and the seeds of yet another conflict were quietly taking root. In this relentless world, there was no such thing as enough. Ambition knew no bounds, bloodshed had no limits, and the cycle of war was unending. For the Diadochi, peace was never the destination. It was merely a pause,